everybody. And first thing, thanks to the organizers really for inviting me this morning to this really interesting discussion. And after listening all the presentations in the morning and the discussions, I think I'm going to change completely my presentation and just go to the hot points that were at the table. Also because of time, it's not a lot. But before anything, and after listening to different legal frameworks in Australia, Canada, I want to make clear three things before going forward with this presentation. The first one is that, well, I work for EFSA, and EFSA in the European framework is not the legislator, and is really not taking care of enforcement. Those are the member state authorities. The Commission and the member states are making the legislation, are also interpreting the legislation and doing the enforcement. So EFSA is only doing the scientific assessment, and sometimes you know already that the answers are going to depend what the question is, okay? Second thing is that in Europe, food is safe. If it's in the market, it's safe, otherwise it shouldn't be in the market. So the regulation on health claims made on food is for food, which also includes food supplements. Food supplements are food in European legislation. And then there is a principle of safety, and this is not a regulation about safety assessment. So the assessment of health claims do not include a safety assessment. That can be requested by the Commission as a second step before authorizing health claims to be put in the market. The third premise I wanted to talk to you about is about the issue of nutrient profiles, which I heard before from Australia. The claims regulation foresees the implementation of nutrient profiles. That was expected to happen somewhere in 2008 or 10. Didn't happen yet. There were many problems to do that, and different pressure lines, as you can understand. Industry is asking not to implement nutrient profiles. Consumer associations are very heavily insisting that the claims regulation has no sense if it's implemented without nutrient profiles, for the issues you may imagine. And now I'm going to focus on the type of claims in the European regulation that have been addressing or could address claims on glycemic index, glycemic load, glycemic responses. One of them, the first one, is nutrient claims. And we heard already in the previous presentation the difficulties to consider this low GI claim. At the moment, you know that the fourth premise I wanted to make is that in Europe, all claims need pre-authorization, okay? What is not authorized is forbidden. And for the nutrition claims, all authorized nutrition claims are in the annex of the regulation. Some of them were at the beginning in 2006. Some others have been added later because it's a live annex. It can be updated anytime. And then one of the new claims we have several, are the ones on rich in omega-3 fatty acids, for example. They were incorporated later in the process. Then there are many claims that have been requested by member states to the Commission to be included in the annex. You have here some of them, but there are up to 40 or 50 nutrition claims that have not been authorized, and EFSA has not been requested an advice on them. The issue in some of them, I could include here claims on high in antioxidants, high in probiotics. They were also requested as nutrition claims. But the Commission and member states interpreted, because they are the ones interpreting the legislation, that these claims could be understood by the consumer as health claims. So as having an effect on health that goes beyond the nutrient content. Of course, the paradox, as was discussed before this morning, is that the rationale to approve certain nutrient claims is that the relationship between the nutrient and health had to be proven to be nutrition claims, okay? So now we have been doing an exercise of having requested function claims on nutrients, which are already authorized as nutrient claims, just to make the link that is not explicit in nutrient claims with the health benefit, okay? But that is a requirement already to have a nutrient claim on a nutrient, that there is a relationship between nutrient and health. So I must say, mostly in the Nordic countries, that when before the European legislation, they were regulating claims in the market. Different member states differently. They had these claims on low GI for quite some while in the market, and they were requesting to have exactly the same claim as a nutrition claim in the European legislation. But then there were some considerations made regarding whether that should be a nutrition claim or not. As I said, we didn't get an official request for a scientific assessment, but in the background, I think one of the issues were that in 2010 were published the dietary reference values for carbohydrates and dietary fiber at European level that were saying, well, the relationship between GI, GL, and health is cloudy at the moment, so there is not sufficient scientific evidence to make dietary reference values for GI or GL. That was one of the conclusions from the dietary reference values. So I think part of it was, well, until the relationship with health is not well established, we cannot really think about that. The second reason, as I said before, is because the low GI claim was perceived or was thought to be perceived by consumers really as a health claim. So you would need to substantiate the relationship with health before, okay? Then we have the function claims. Some of them here that will fit the claims on reducing postprandial glucose responses, or even longer-term claims on blood glucose control, okay? And then we have the disease risk reduction claims, or the reduction of a risk factor for a disease. Here, I must say, EFSA has been trying to, in the scientific evaluations, to make, let's say, I don't know how to say this. Okay, the regulation requires that not to be a medicinal claim, you cannot refer to the reduction of the risk of disease directly, but only to the reduction of a risk factor for disease, and then say there are many risk factors for a disease. The reduction of this one may or may not reduce the risk of disease, just to avoid this to be medicinal claims. But scientifically speaking, it's true, as the scientific community has been making the point several times, that the strong evidence you can have for a disease risk reduction claim is the relationship between the food and the disease, and not the risk factor for the disease, okay? So in this context, evidence is being evaluated in a very, I must say, different way as the regulation is requesting. And then if the relationship between the food or the nutrient and the disease is very clear, the risk factor can be found out. It does not need to be a modified risk factor for disease, as proven by intervention studies modifying the risk factor and the disease at the same time, okay? But this is only to overcome this regulatory requirement we have. Then I want to say also that health claims are voluntary. You don't need to pass a health claim evaluation to put the product in the market, okay? Are not about dietary recommendations. We don't have general claims on dietary advice on what is good for you. We have 27 member states with very different dietary recommendations among them. And it's more about what can I say about my product, okay? And that has a very tight regulatory framework. For that, EFSA needs to know really what is the food or the constituent we're talking about. It needs to be really well characterized, and that may depend on the claimed effect on the claim you are making. The second, so many foods that are good, very well characterized to establish dietary reference values, dietary fiber, for example, is not for health claims. Second, the health claim needs to be defined and needs to be a beneficial physiological effect. So far, the panel considered that reduction in postprandial glucose responses is considered as a beneficial physiological effect, as long as postprandial insulinic responses are not disproportionately increased. And this is the same as for Health Canada, I heard. But this is not excluding other claims. The burden is put on the applicant. If somebody comes and says, decreasing postprandial blood glucose responses by increasing insulin secretion in this context is beneficial, they only need to convince EFSA. They only need to provide evidence that that is a beneficial physiological effect. But nobody did that so far. And the old claim we had on amino acids decreasing postprandial blood glucose responses through increasing insulin secretion, they were unable to provide the evidence that that was a beneficial physiological effect. EFSA doesn't say it's not. But if the evidence is not provided, cannot give a positive opinion on that. And then the evaluation stops at the claim effect level. It first needs to be beneficial. And then, of course, a cause and effect relationship needs to be established between the consumption of the food and the claimed effect for the target group under the proposed conditions of use. So there are a lot of constraints there to be taken into account. I'm going to just skip this one and just say that for the claims submitted for postprandial blood glucose responses, and now I'm talking only about function claims, okay? There are 3 different types of claims that EFSA had on the table. First, claims that were claiming an independent effect for food constituent on postprandial blood glucose responses. And these were for food constituents that, when added to carbohydrate-containing foods, could reduce blood glucose responses. And I'm talking about dietary fiber, most of them, okay? So the content of available carbohydrates in the test and in the control food was the same. The test food had something else added. Then we had claims on food constituents that were used in replacement of another food constituent with an independent effect on increased postprandial blood glucose responses, for example, digestible carbohydrates, glucose. Then, of course, they were lowering glycemic responses, all right? It just, you had a lower amount of digestible carbohydrates. And that's, I think, is very well-established science, right? And then claims on a property of certain available carbohydrates versus all certain other available carbohydrates. So same amount of carbohydrates in the test and control food, but they behave differently with respect to the claimed effect. And then we have many unfavorable health claims evaluations, and for many reasons. In some of them, the food constituent was not sufficiently described in relation to the claimed effect. And those are all the claims that the food was low GI foods or low GL foods. EFSA was unable to know what that meant. There was not given a definition for that, not even a GI value for that. You know, we got different suggestions, different proposals. We could not define the food constituent on the basis of that attribute. For many, as I said before, there was no evidence that it was a beneficial physiological effect for the target population. And so for some others, we just didn't get evidence on the effect. I'm going to skip that. And here, I wanted also to highlight that a claim having a positive opinion by EFSA does not mean automatically that it's going to be authorized, or a claim having a positive opinion of EFSA because it's scientifically true. We cannot say that differently, but for which probably the EFSA committees will have some problems about the authorization. It's not up to EFSA to block authorization on that. And I'm referring to some of the claims like the claims on fructose as compared to glucose, some claims on, for example, polyols replacing glucose. So those were factually true, but then how these are implemented, whether these need to be authorized or implemented or not, is not on EFSA's hands anymore. So here, from substantiation to authorization then, here there are some issues that are only considered by risk managers, by the Commission and member states. For example, claims cannot imply that food is unsafe for the reasons I said before, okay? or they need to consider whether a claim may lead to excessive consumption of food that should not be recommended. For example, claims on 100% sugar foods. Or safety aspects which are not directly assessed by EFSA, but they can request after a safety assessment from EFSA. Or they need to consider whether claims cannot refer to a property which is common for virtually all foods. We have recently a request for a claim on a bread, and the comparator was glucose. That EFSA had to issue an opinion saying almost any food is going to have that effect. You know, almost any food, if compared to glucose, is going to increase blood glucose less. So then, of course, that was a very clear advice to the Commission on what to do with that claim, because that should be an illegal claim. Okay? Then, of course, they need to consider about factors about the feasibility of the implementation, and this relation with the slowly digestive starch claim. That we'll hear about that later today. And of course, they need to consider consumer understanding. This is not EFSA's role. And thank you. I think I touched on almost every issue you were interested in, but I'd be happy to get questions. Thank you.
Well, just based on your Frank Sachs, Harvard. Oh, a very interesting talk, and it seems to me then, based on your last slide, that any glycemic index claim would be disallowed because, you know, for the example that you gave, blood glucose is a standard, and then some bread increased blood glucose less. I mean, that's sort of the definition of a reduced glycemic index. Is that so, that basically the glycemic index would not be allowable?
I mean, actually, for the studies we got for most of the claims on reduced glycemic responses were GI testing studies, actually. You know, because this is what you're testing, actually. You know, it's not that you give a number for it, but you give the curve, and then for some of them, looking also the insulin responses, then that is enough to substantiate a claim postprandial or low postprandial glucose responses. The thing is, all these are comparative claims. And of course, when you're trying to compare anything against glucose, anything is possible. Anything is going to be lower. But in those circumstances, what EFSA asked the Commission to consider is whether that was a fair comparison. It's very difficult to say what a fair comparison is. For example, for the Commission, a fair comparison could be foods that can be interchangeable on a consuming occasion. For example, it's very difficult that we would choose to eat either pure glucose or bread on a consuming occasion, right? So I think this is what was an argument in order to, there is no decision on that claim yet, but of course, this is an argument that is being discussed not to authorize that claim. We didn't, but funny enough, I must say that we didn't get claims from industry comparing pasta with bread, for example. So foods that could be consumed on a similar occasion, yeah, but claiming that one in relation to the other had a lower glycemic index or a lower glycemic response. So is industry not interested in those claims? Are they very difficult to demonstrate? I'm not sure. We didn't get those so far.
So would white bread be more acceptable?
Yes, because those are comparative claims, and for a scientific evaluation, EFSA is only requesting that the conditions for the claim are well defined. So you need to define the food, but also the comparator.
Yeah.
This is the only thing you need to do.
Dr. Jenkins?
Geordie and I were just, Silvia, thank you. Geordie and I were just having a chat, and really we're worried, I think, that regulators want to have precise definitions in a very fluid area of science that is evolving all the time. I mean, we were just discussing the fat story. Is it the fat? Is it the quality of the fat? Is it the quality of the protein? Is it the quality of the fiber? Is it the quality? And these things then become clouded with, have you got definite data to show that there's, as you say, is there some outcome? Show me an outcome which is incontrovertible, which is not to be argued with. And we often don't have those data. And then can we go the stage further and say that there's a disease risk reduction? I think we're really in the stage where, we're even reevaluating our views about saturated fat. So, and that's really in terms of heart disease. So I think that we're in a difficult situation. I think we have to recognize that as regulators, you need to have things black and white. They're often decided on small numbers of studies by committees with their own particular views and biases, as we know committees have. So that I think we're just in a difficult situation now for regulators because we're expecting you to do, I think, more than you can.
If I, yeah. Again, we are not regulators, but I understand, but I think you're right. But also, we need to understand also the context in which this is, health claims are really not about nutrition education or dietetic guidelines. This is something different, I would say, which probably, and this is a personal comment, not from EFSA, okay? I really have a lot of doubts that, or how, to the extent to which food labeling can contribute to consumer education. Because very few consumers read labels and even less understand what labels mean. So probably to do the nutrition education need to be through other channels. And this is a personal opinion, again. So of course, for regulatory science goes much behind than scientific advances in nutrition. They are always behind. Regulatory science regulates on what is almost established, on what is sure, on what can be implemented in a reasonable way, the same for everybody. So I agree with that. It's true.
Yes, there were actually Kathy.
Okay. Kathy Weimer, General Mills. I was just curious, in the case of a comparative claim of if there were one to be permitted, would the requirement have something around showing a statistically significant difference between those two products, and would it be about the glycemic index potentially, or would it have to demonstrate something beyond that that's a physiological difference between the two? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think the claims are phrased as decrease in postprandial glucose responses and non-low GI, because they need to refer explicitly to the modification of a function of the body. That's why our phrase is, decrease postprandial blood glucose. But as I said before, evidence provided can be GI testing, and so far only a statistically significant difference is needed for EFSA to conclude positively. Of course, if you have 10 subjects, if you get a study with 100 subjects, we'll have some doubts about whether that has any biological meaning, right? But usually this type of studies, as we heard before, are done with 10 subjects, 12 subjects. Statistical significance difference there, it can be close to the biological relevance. So I think there are no rules on that for that reason.
I think we have Alfred and Jordi and Paolo.
Okay. As a follow-up to Catherine's question, for example, if you mentioned that if it could be the basis of the difference could be around the glycemic index of the food. But we know that for the glycemic index, it's really based on a 50 grams available carbohydrate. Do you look, when you do the assessment, at the amount of food that is reasonably consumed at a sitting to demonstrate the effect, or you would look at an effect of the food that is consumed in large amount, but whether or not this would be meaningful in terms of how much the consumer actually eat.
Now, this is very interesting. I think it depends really very much on the type of claim we have on the table. Because we had before, as I said, different types of claims. Some of them is about the addition of something. For example, claims adding fiber and decreasing digestion and absorption of carbohydrates. Some others about the replacement of glucose by polyols, yeah, which is completely different type of claim, even if the claim is the same. And other ones about replacing digestible by non-digestible carbohydrates, which is again something different. So there, the thing is, first we consider whether the scientific evidence is there, and the 50 grams is fine, okay? And then, of course, we need to establish conditions of use for the claim. In some cases, we have things that when it's very clear, for example, if you are replacing glucose, there is very little to argue about that. With polyols, any amount theoretically will contribute. And then establishing conditions of use is going to, from a scientific point of view, any amount is going to contribute to the effect. But then establishing conditions of use is really a risk management decision. How much you need to replace. Is 10%, is 15%, is 30%? Is the same as for the claims on vitamins and minerals, the essential role of vitamins and minerals. Is true, but how much you need for the function, sometimes you cannot tell. And in those cases, regulators usually link the nutrition claim to the health claim to establish conditions of use. For example, if you say low glucose is 30% less than, low sugars is 30% less than a normal product, then they just say 30%. But this is really a management decision. Yeah, and that goes on a case-by-case basis, I must say.
I'm sorry, Paolo Petroni was based in Sand for quite a while.
Yes.
So yes, go ahead.
Okay, from the company Enervit. In Europe, we have a few health claims related to, for example, isomaltulose or resistant starches and reduction of blood glucose response. Which I think is a synonymous of reduction of glycemic response in terms of flexibility of wording, but no claims related to, for example, isomaltulose and reduction of glycemic index. So today we saw that glycemic index and glycemic load are maybe more solid than glycemic response. So can we expect in the future some claims perhaps related to isomaltulose and reduction of glycemic index in place of blood glucose response? Because this makes a big difference for industries in terms of consumer awareness. Glycemic index has now 30 years of consumer awareness. Glycemic response or blood glucose response is not having such an awareness. So that would be very important for the industry, and I do not see a reason why we should not allow glycemic index in the same sentence with the same meaning if related to isomaltulose or to resistant starches or beta-glucans or whatever.
As I said before, EFSA does not take care of consumer understanding and has the regulatory constraint of these claims need to refer to a function of the body. Low GI is not, okay? Then another issue is EFSA gives a wording that reflects the scientific evidence. That's it. During the authorization process, then the industries can negotiate and renegotiate with the Commission wordings that meet better the consumer understanding. So wordings that can help them to communicate better to the consumers. So,
I think that the main part of your data on isomaltulose or resistant starches have been provided in the form of glycemic index, but there are some representative from Beneo, I think. So
I'm perfectly aware of that.
Okay,
but the
so
claim cannot be low glycemic index.
No, not low glycemic index, but isomaltulose, if replacing sugar on a 30% degrees, is reducing glycemic index of food in place of blood glucose response.
But the claim must be a function claim. Must refer to the function of the body, not to the function of the food. Sorry, this is the regulatory requirement.
I think we have Jordi and Tom and Gabriele. Whoever
I wanted to address
wants
that
address
point.
this last question.
Did you want to address it as well?
Okay. I have understood that it is possible to have a health claim when we compare two kind of bread, for example, with different ingredients or substituting ingredients. And if it is demonstrated that it decreases the glucose response, we can arrive to have a health claim. But it is possible to have a health claim for an ingredient.
Yes, I said that before. Oh,
Yes.
For example, some
have.
kind
For-
of fiber of beta
For
glucan.
instance, we have the health
Yes.
claim for isomaltolose.
Yes,
Or
and there are
fructose.
If you have this amount of this ingredient, you have also the health claim. Okay.
Tom and Gabriele.
I just wanted to respond to that comment because if you're replacing available carbohydrate with an unavailable, it is not a glycemic index you're measuring. And people may have called it that, but they're wrong. Now, it might reduce the GI, perhaps, but you'd have to equalize the amount of available carb. This is why I'm in favor of a glycemic response claim for these kinds of products. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what they do.
Just to move.
And Gabriele, you other
carbohydrate. Yes.
Isomaltulose is available carb? Well, then, okay. Okay, well, if that's the case, then but you put resistant starch in there as well, which is not necessarily available. Anyway.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Gabriele, sorry, yes.
Thank you, Silvia, for your presentation. And also, I want to thank you particularly because you have been able to evolve the view of the panel which you are responsible for over time according to the evolution of the science in this context. I think it is important, this ability to change your mind in relation to some of the points, taking profit of what is coming out in the literature, not going on always with the same attitude. In particular, I want to refer to the issue of the insulin response in parallel with the glucose decline. Before, your panel was more strict in relation to this aspect. Now you are more flexible, and I appreciate that because you see, the early insulin response cannot be reduced, the early insulin response, because this is a marker for the risk of developing diabetes. So if you are able to increase the early insulin response by a food, that's a beneficial physiological function, because you want to have early insulin response to be high. Conversely, the late insulin response, that is more a marker of insulin sensitivity, that you don't want that to have increased. So I think that there might be possibility, as you say, case by case, evaluating the insulin response and deciding whether it is beneficial or not.
I think the panel has been always very open to that, but the burden must not be in the panel to find the evidence on what can be or not beneficial. It must be the applicants making their case, and making their case sound. And also in this context, it's beneficial for whom? Because the target population cannot be diabetic patients, even if the study population may be, not the target population. So there is a whole thing, whole proof of evidence, not for the substantiation, that for the benefit that needs to be provided. And of course, the panel will always evaluate that.
Yeah, but I was referring to the fact that a low early insulin response is a marker of future development of diabetes in the general population. Now, if you have a food in which you are able, for instance, to increase GLP-1 production in the gut, and by doing that, you are able to increase the early insulin response and reduce the glucose response after the meal. This is a beneficial insulin response, even though you have an increased early insulin rise. So you have to evaluate. This could be one of the situations where you could say, okay, it does not reduce insulin, but this is not going to be harmful for the general population.
So yeah, there's no one answer fits all. Yeah, so that right.
Of course, it is a very valid argument. Just need to be put together and sent to us.
Jenny, I think that's
Just a brief over comment. It seems to me that EFSA is operating on the process that is favouring the food industry, favouring manufactured foods, favouring specific ingredients that do things, supplements to foods, rather than favouring unprocessed food or nature's food right from the beginning. And I might say, for example, that glucose and glycemic index and the insulin business, it would mean breast milk didn't get a low GI claim because it stimulates insulin.
I mean, so far breast milk is not something you put in the market, but it could happen. No.
A better example would be oats and the progressive processing of oats, fine flaking into instant oats, and then puffing and popping. So you've got something that's gone from a GI of about 40 up to something that's going to 90. You've doubled the physiological response, but there's no way at the moment that EFSA would allow you to make that observation on the food label.
I mean, again, it's not a matter of EFSA allowing or not. It's really not up to EFSA. So that the legislation, for the legislation of food includes also food supplements. It's not EFSA's business, really. That the health claims require characterization, very good characterization of the food you're making the claim on. It's not EFSA's, that is in the legislation. You see? EFSA is looking also at the, as I said before, at the GI and GL in another context when establishing dietary reference values for carbohydrates and dietary fiber. And there, the issue is different. You can look at, wider foods which are less well characterized for enforcement issues because that's a matter of dietary reference value. So I think it's very important to differentiate the context in which GI, GL, and glycemic responses are being considered. But many times EFSA is not deciding there. It's just the legal framework is what it is. Yeah.
So I just want to ask actually a question. I'm a bit confused. In Europe, can one company put a GI value on their product?
No, it's prohibited.
Just the value.
No.
You can claim a product XYZ containing ingredient XYZ is inducing a lower blood glucose response, but you cannot write a GI, even if it's a low GI or a medium GI, on a food product.
And it